Welcome back to Face the Nation. We continue our conversation with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates. What's your sense overall of President Trump as an unpredictable leader?
Broadly, philosophically, I'm in agreement with his disruptive approach. So in government, I'm a strong believer in the need for reform of government agencies and departments. They have gotten fat and sloppy, and they're not user-friendly. They are inefficient. They cost too much. I also think on the foreign policy side that there is a need for disruption. You know, we've had 3 administrations follow a pretty consistent policy toward North Korea, and it really hasn't gotten us anywhere. So the notion of disrupting and sort of putting the Chinese on notice that it's no longer business as usual for the United States, I think is a good thing. Now the question is, obviously, in the implementation of disruption. On the foreign policy side, there's the risk of being too spontaneous and too disruptive, where you end up doing more harm than damage. And figuring out that balance is where having strong people around you matters.
What advice would you give the president before his first big foreign trip that he's about to take?
That's a good question. I think that the key will be to limit spontaneity to areas that are fun or that sort of say something about you as a real person. I think when it comes to the issues, I'd advise him to stick to the script. But, I mean, he is going to have some very tough conversations, and he's going to be talking about some very tough and complicated issues in all of the places that he visits. But I think any time a president does things that are humanizing, I think it's good.
Should the use of Twitter stop at the water's edge?
Well, not necessarily, but I would be careful.
Let me ask you about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. You used to be head of the CIA. If you got information that the National Security Advisor had not told the truth about a contact with a Russian ambassador, how serious of an issue would that be if it were brought to you?
Well, I would certainly make sure that the president knew that that we had learned this. If we got that information in an intelligence report, then I would probably have sought a private meeting with the president to share that with him.
The concern was that the Russians would be able to blackmail the former National Security Advisor because of what they knew he had said something untrue and then caused the vice president to say something untrue. Is that a plausible, possible outcome and something to be worried about?
You know, in all honesty, I think it's kind of a stretch. You know, it's one thing if somebody working for the U.S. government has sold secrets to the other side. It's another if they have something in their personal life that they're hiding for which they could be blackmailed. Having evidence that they didn't tell the truth to somebody in the same building where they work, maybe it's just the old intel guy, it's a problem. And it's a problem, like I just said, that I would tell the president about. But it's not the same as, and it's hard for me, I don't know General Flynn well, but it's hard for me to believe anybody would allow themselves to be blackmailed by the Russians because they didn't tell the full story or didn't tell the truth to the Vice President of the United States, who works 50 feet down the hall. You know, maybe he could have been blackmailed. It's theoretically possible. I just think it's a different kind of situation than we would have thought of in the intelligence business.
The president met with the Russian foreign minister and the ambassador in the Oval Office. There were pictures of them smiling in the Oval Office. What did you make of that meeting?
For a long time, Soviet foreign ministers would come in to see the president all the time, routinely. Jimmy Carter stopped that after the invasion of Afghanistan. Ronald Reagan resumed it in 1984, I think. And so the fact of a meeting like that, I think, is not that big a deal.
The Trump White House kept American photographers and press out of the room. The photographs were released by the Russians. What do you make of that?
I thought that was all pretty odd.
Pretty odd.
Yeah.
Not worth repeating. There's important business on the table with Russia all over the world. But there is also this, the intelligence community has a consensus that the Russians did meddle in the last election. So people look at smiling photographs in the Oval Office, and they look at this effort to meddle in the election, and they say, is there a disconnect there? Should there be sterner faces and a harsher approach to Russia?
Well, I think in the policies that have been followed since the president came into office, there really hasn't been any slack cut for the Russians. And I think one of the things that has surprised people has been that the relationship between the United States and Russia has in fact deteriorated since the election. The administration, the contrast between the way they have treated the Russians and the way they have reacted to the Chinese is pretty stark. So, you know, having smiles in the Oval Office, I don't know, maybe I'm just getting too old, but I don't think that's that big a deal. It's in their policies and in their actions that really matters, and in those arenas, I think they've been pretty tough-minded.
Some analysts look at Russia and say what Vladimir Putin really wanted by being involved in the U.S. election was just to throw the West into a kind of chaotic state, to undermine U.S. institutions. Do you think that Putin is getting what he wants?
Well, I think that he is certainly getting a lot of publicity for what the Russians are doing, and I'm not sure that's unwelcome to him. Look, I think this is a guy who saw the U.S. basically come out against him in his re-election campaign in 2012. He saw the U.S. being behind all of the color revolutions in Eastern Europe and in Georgia and Ukraine and so on. So his view is the West has been interfering in his politics for years. And I think that he has decided in a very strategic way to turn the tables and do everything in his power to, as we describe Russian elections as illegitimate, to try and communicate to the rest of the world that Western elections are illegitimate. And it's not just us. We know that now. It's Germany, it's France, it's a number of other countries, and it's a very broad and not very well disguised effort to create questions about the legitimacy of these Western elections. And I think, this is very KGB.
In North Korea, the president is relying very heavily on China. Is he relying too much on China so that it makes it hard for him to push back on China when it comes to the South China Sea or human rights or intellectual property rights?
I think that that the disruptive nature, the tough talk on North Korea, the military deployments, sending the missile defense system to South Korea, I think these are all good things to have done. And I think he's gotten China's attention to a degree that his predecessors have not, that this is a very serious matter for the United States. My last visit to China as secretary, January 2011, I told President Hu, just like this, President of the United States wanted me to tell you that we now consider North Korea a direct threat to the United States. And it had no effect whatsoever. I think President Trump has their attention. And my one concern is that he may overestimate how much power China has in Pyongyang. They do have influence, and they do have companies, and they do have economic relationships that could make life much more difficult in the North. Their balancing act is how much worse can we make it in the North without creating that which scares us more than anything, which is a collapse in the North. And then what happens to all those nuclear weapons? So they're going to work very hard to avoid that. It's clear the relationship between China and North Korea has hardly ever been worse. Kim Jong-un has never been to Beijing in his leadership. President Xi has never been to North Korea. That's a first in that relationship. The Chinese press are saying some amazingly negative things about the North and about Kim Jong-un. So they are weighing in, and they are bringing greater pressure. Whether it will be enough, I think remains to be seen.
A lot of people look at this president and think he is out of the bounds of the normal presidency. But your descriptions and assessment of the administration seems like you see him within the bounds of a normal presidency. Is that fair?
I mean, again, I have tried to focus most of what I've talked about on the foreign policy side. That's the part I know. I didn't think this whole business with Director Comey was handled well. So there are sort of day-to-day aspects of the operation that I think are really troublesome. And I know that there are a lot of people in the country who have lots of issues with decisions that he's making on the domestic side. The thing that reassures me some on the foreign policy side is that he and his team seem to have worked out a relationship of trust, and a lot of the extraneous or extemporaneous things that were going on early on have largely settled out.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with more of our panel. And we're back with more from our political panel. Peggy Noonan is a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and her best-selling book, The Time of Our Lives, is out in paperback. Peggy was also recently awarded the Pulitzer Prize for last year's campaign commentary, and we congratulate her for that.
Thank you.
Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor of The Atlantic. David Ignatius is a columnist for The Washington Post, and Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. David, I want to start with you. Coming out of what Secretary Gates said, he feels reassured by the foreign policy team that the president has around him. What do you make of that?
Bob Gates, as we just heard, is the steady voice of continuity. He's been around since the Reagan presidency, and he has that depth and clarity. And he's right. Trump chose a national security team that's first rate. A lot of them are people that Gates recommended. Rex Tillerson was a Gates proposal. It's the State Department. James Mattis, a general widely admired. Secretary Kelly at Homeland Security was actually Bob Gates' military advisor way back when. H.R. McMaster similarly came up in that sort of broad school that Gates helped preside over. I thought I heard Secretary Gates say that on domestic policy he is troubled. As he looks at the Comey firing, he finds elements that worry him. And so the obvious point is that President Trump and the Senate need to respond to this week that we've had by choosing someone to run the FBI who is in that category of strong, steady, reliable national security leaders that we just talked about, that Bob Gates, in a sense, represents. If they can make a nomination like that, they've got some former judges who are terrific. Mike Rogers, who was recommended by former FBI agents, ran a bipartisan committee and made it work. But if they can choose somebody that the country will trust, who's on that list, then I think they begin to get out of this.
Peggy, Secretary Gates said the president needs to limit spontaneity overseas.
Yes.
What are your expectations for this big foreign policy trip the president has?
That was a deft way, I think, for Mr. Gates to say, please don't freak us out while you're overseas. I take a very simple, unlettered view of this big foreign policy trip from the president. I think he's saying essentially, I am Trump and I am real. I am a real president. I am doing what real presidents do. I'm meeting with popes. I'm meeting with sheikhs. I sort of think, in a way, most foreign policy trips involve a certain symbolic acting out of who you are. So I think the trip essentially is meant to say, I'm here and I'm normal. I hope, as Gates says, he doesn't get too colorful or anything like that. I know there are serious foreign policy components to the discussions. I'm going to leave it to you guys. But to me, this is symbolic, and I hope it is peaceful. It would be very nice if we got a little no trouble that is unneeded. Calm. Grown up. I know, but
chances are slim that he's going to say something in front of the Pope that causes an ignition. It's after.
Is that
on
a dare?
Twitter.
Plus, the Pope will forgive him. He's in that business.
Right. No, I don't. I don't think it's going to be. The trips are very scripted. It's after the trip. It's when you have a crisis. I hate to keep going back to this point about crises, but these trips are scripted to avoid crises. He's not going to try to instigate a new Israeli-Palestinian peace process, I think, at this moment. But what I worry about is when you know what it is? It's the 3 a.m. phone call. We haven't had the 3 a.m. phone call yet. And it's not clear to me that even that iron triangle of Tillerson, McMaster, Mattis can stop an impulsive reaction on the part of the president that might not be easily pulled back.
The issue here, too, just to get back to Comey for a moment, is that the president has a way of taking something that ought to be done and making it more chaotic than it deserves to be. It's my opinion that James Comey deserved to be fired, that it was clear that he deserved to be fired, that his incompetence in the investigation of Hillary Clinton alone deserved that, even without the various points that he made afterwards. And he had lost and burned through a lot of bipartisan goodwill on both sides of the aisle. But that's not why the president made the decision that he did. John Podesta, the morning that James Comey was fired, tweeted out in reference to his testimony the previous day that the American public is getting mildly nauseous listening to James Comey. That's fine, that may be true, but that isn't the reason that the president ought to have made the decision that he made. And that led to all of the chaos this week for something that ought to have been much more organized, much more laid out, and as Bob Gates said, something that's planned where everybody says, this is why we did the thing we did.
Peggy, let me ask you about that chaos, because idiosyncratic president with some disruption going on. Secretary Gates suggested that in some places that disruption was doing some good things, getting NATO to pay up, getting the North Koreans to realize America was serious. But in this case, the president said he made his decision for reason X. And then the vice president went out and said, yes, it was because of the Hillary Clinton email server.
Yes.
So the vice president is now on the hook for an explanation that the president then undermined. So isn't that a cost of chaos to his vice president?
Oh, sure. Trump always puts his people on the hook. Do you know what I mean? He doesn't just harm himself. He harms his whole operation when he acts in this antic manner. But let me tell you quickly something I'm thinking of as we all speak here about this whole Comey drama. What obsesses us in Washington, as we well know, is not necessarily what obsesses America. What we talk about on this panel is not our views, not necessarily reflected out there. I was so struck yesterday with everybody I know in conversations. It was all about Comey, the FBI, who's the next guy. Then I put on the TV and I see the president wowing them at Liberty University. They got their MAGA hats on. I am struck by the distance between our conversation and the national conversation, and I'm struck by the distance between Democrats and Republicans as they approve or disapprove of the Comey thing. It's an 80-20. Democrats are 80%, I hate the Comey firing. Republicans are 80%, I love the Comey firing. This
on the other hand, he's not the most popular president we've seen at this point. Liberty University might be a little bit outside the norm.
He's got his base, is what I mean.
The base
is
not
growing.
40% of the country thinks he's right. I heard from a Republican this week the best argument against having a special prosecutor, which Adam Schiff and others have called for, which is you need to keep regular order. You need to say to the 40% who voted for him, we're not creating a special committee prosecutor to get your guy. We're not out to get you and what you voted for, and keep it regular. Ask the politicians who were elected to run it, to run the investigations. Ask them to reject a bad FBI nominee. If he sends up a crony, a bad person, the Republicans have to vote against him. I mean, that's when we'll know that we're getting better here. If the Republicans reject a bad nominee.
Ben, what's your sense of where Republicans are in response to this? Because, of course, what Peggy says is right, and the president knows how to use and that disconnect between. But there are some things still in this day and age in which people in Washington are supposed to be concerned about a few things, even if the country isn't. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of what they're here for.
What I hear mostly from the Republicans that I talk to is they're concerned that this level of chaos will prevent them from furthering an agenda that they need to run on in a year and a half, that they believe is very important. I think they would be very disappointed if anyone who was not a qualified individual was put forward for the FBI director position. I think, though, the real concern they have is we need to pass a health care law. We need to pass a tax reform law in order for us to be able to go back to our constituents and get reelected in a year and a half. And that's something they worry will be negatively affected by all this.
Let me make one quick point about stability and truth-telling and chaos theory. At some point in the future, Donald Trump is going to have to organize an international coalition of some sort in order to combat a serious problem. Let's assume it's North Korea for right now. Bob Gates worked for President George H.W. Bush, who organized one of the greatest coalitions in history with James Baker against Saddam Hussein in 1991. They did that because they had credibility, because people understood them to be steady and stable and telling them the truth. And this president is, our current president, is spending down that capital, what little capital he had on that, very, very quickly. And so we're heading into a possibility of a situation in which he has no credibility on the international stage when he's going to need it.
Peggy, let me ask you, just back on the domestic for a moment, though. As Ben says, there are a lot of things that aren't getting discussed.
Yes,
and now this sense of unpredictability. If I'm a Republican, how do I handle the fact that you've got a president who is going to be doing some exciting things that you might have to answer for?
Exciting things, what a nice way to put it. What David said. A big decision will be made now about the FBI. If a serious, sober, low-drama, integritous person is put forward, everybody will be relieved, actually, and they'll go for it. If some sleazeball is put forward, forgive my language, or some toady or whatever, Republicans will stand up and say, this won't do. I really think that will happen, but I also think it's what ought to happen.
All right, I'm going to have to stop you there. We got to talk about Mom. Sorry, Peggy. Coming up, a tribute to moms. Mother's Day is a welcome event in partisan times. Nearly everyone agrees that we should show mothers gratitude. For those of us who have lost our mothers, there is a little melancholy in the day, though. But that melancholy can be put to good use, a lesson I learned from my mother and that I recommend. When she died, Mom left me her letters and journals, windows into things I would have been too young to understand when she was alive, or too busy, or too much of a know-it-all. What these papers show is her grit. She was a journalist who, for a decade or so, was told that because she was a woman, she couldn't be on television with the men. She got there eventually, but she also later got fired. In her journals, she is scared. There were times the bills couldn't be paid. At one point, she typed a letter to her children on carbon paper from the office. It was to be read in case she died. She was on the road all the time working and worried something might happen to her. Nothing happened, but that letter and all her letters are a lesson, a gift, and a guide. They make sense now that I'm old enough to understand them and see myself in her blemishes too. The pride and selfishness that trips up all of us from time to time. So as a tribute to my mom, I write letters to my kids on Mother's Day. Letters like the one she left me, to be opened when I'm gone and they're older and the contents make more sense. If I'm around when they're my age, maybe we'll open these letters and read them together, if I'm brave enough. And we'll all thank Mom. Back in a moment. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.